So if you're anything like me, then you might have seen those dopamine detoxing, dopamine is the problem, cut out dopamine videos, like change your life by doing dopamine detoxing. And honestly, I think all of these are great, but you've probably wondered, like, does it actually work? Because you might have not tried it. You might have tried it, but you're like, yeah, I'm still not sure. If things first, what is dopamine and what is dopamine detoxing? So, like, in nerd speak, dopamine detoxing is a neurotransmitter, and it's essentially like the neurotransmitter of motivation. So, like, honestly, I cannot explain to you what a neurotransmitter is. Like, right this moment, I have the intellectual capabilities to give you the perfect definition of neurotransmitter, but essentially think of dopamine as not the molecule of pleasure, but the molecule of, like, motivation and craving. And dopamine detoxing is essentially like cutting out bad habits. So like high dopamine activities are things like scrolling on YouTube, TikTok, like watching porn, eating a shit ton of junk food. All of these things are very high dopamine activities, meaning that they raise your dopamine levels very, very high. And if you didn't know, like, the reason why so many people try to do a dopamine detox, and they might not actually know this, is because during really high level dopamine activities, like video games, like eating junk food, your dopamine goes up and up and up and up, but essentially your body has a thing called homeostasis, and think of homeostasis as the perfect balance. So your body always wants the perfect balance, and so if dopamine goes up and up and up, then dopamine has to go down, and you have a baseline level of dopamine in your body. So think of it as the reservoir of dopamine. Like, I have like 20 dopamine, and when I go on TikTok, my dopamine goes up 10, but then it drops 15, and so now I'm at like -5 dopamine, and then I'm like, oh, why do I feel like a piece of shit? So, like, a lot of people, they go on dopamine detoxing because their, like, dopamine receptors are just, like, fucking burnt out. Like, their dopamine reservoir is, like, at a negative level, right? They've just, like, worn out their dopamine receptors, and so they experience pleasure from nothing. And so I think that's pretty sad, and so that's the reason a lot of people go into dopamine detoxing. Put simply, dopamine, molecule of motivation, not really correlated to pleasure, and dopamine detoxing is cutting out all the cheap dopamines. So does it work? Yes. And the main reason why it works, so first, let me be clear. Like, when I mean dopamine detoxing, I don't mean a 24-hour dopamine detoxing fast. I mean, like, a life-changing thing where you cut out the cheap dopamines, you cut out the bad habits, you stop playing video games, you stop watching porn, you stop scrolling. And yes, this does work. And the single greatest reason why it works is because it resets your baseline dopamine level. So you remember that baseline I talked about? And you remember how I said that dopamine was the molecule of motivation? Well, if you have a baseline level of the molecule of motivation, then, like, and if you can get that baseline up, then you essentially have, like, a high level baseline of motivation. And so, like, that's the single greatest benefit you get from dopamine detoxing, is that now you feel like a fucking animal the whole time because your dopamine levels are high, and if your dopamine levels are high, your levels of motivation and craving are high, which result in good work, good results, high productivity. Everybody's happy. But another thing is that I think it improves your mental health, and it allows you to experience fun again, because when you're constantly bombarding your brain with dopamine hit after dopamine hit. Well, actually, dopamine hits don't really exist, but essentially, when you're constantly bombarding yourself with, like, dopamine activity after dopamine activity, like, you're no longer able to feel good when doing dopamine activities. So what I mean is that when it's kind of simple. Like, when you do something too much, you get used to that thing, and that's what happened with a lot of dopamine activities. Like, you do it over and over and over again until you feel numb while doing it. So you need to up the ante and, for example, like, play video games while eating junk food. And so, like, cutting these things out makes, like, doing the hard work that you avoided doing before actually fun, because now, like, in a weird way, that becomes your high level dopamine activities. And I think that, like, dopamine is very closely related to, like, well-being and mental health, and so your mental health improves when you cut out all of the shit habits and all of the high dopamine activity. However, I don't think that you should do, like, a 24-hour dopamine detoxing fast, change your life in 24 hours, because I literally just talked about this in my monk mode video. Like, I don't think that 24 hours or, like, 1 week things, like, those things, I mean, they might work for some people, but I don't think that they'll work for a majority of people. And I think that you don't need a 24-hour change, you need a lifelong change. And so I think that doing like a big dopamine detox where you cut out all of the bad habits, but for the rest of your life, like, I think that's the best way to live your life. Not to do a dopamine detox once every week, not once every month, but to do it like every day. You slowly but surely cut out the high dopamine activities, the bad habits, and then at one point, like, your bad habits like turn into your good habits. Right? Does that make sense? And so, like, meditating, reading, learning, doing hard work, like going to the gym, all of these things become the high rewarding dopamine activities, and you feel really, really great. You get lots of results because you're simply more productive than everybody else, because they haven't cut out the cheap dopamine activities that make the hard work feel hard. Alright, I hope this helped you, and I cannot wait to see the progress that you make. Cheers, bro.